Welcome to History 300, the origins of the First World War. Lecture 9, the Unspoken Assumptions. If we want to try and understand how and why people in the past acted in the way that they did, one of the hardest tasks we have to face is to try to reconstruct the unspoken assumptions that they all carried around with them in their heads. By unspoken assumptions, I mean the set of beliefs about the world which they took as obvious or commonsensical. So obvious and commonsensical that there was little or no need to ever explicitly spell them out. We hold equally unspoken assumptions today. Ask a stranger to identify themselves, for instance, and very likely they'll give their name and, with a bit of extra prodding, their nationality. Because we take it for granted that nationality is one of the primary ways by which human beings conceptualize their own identity. Far fewer people would have regarded nationality as a primary means of identifying themselves 200 years ago, however, and hardly anyone would have done so 1,000 years ago. The point is that unspoken assumptions about the world are not eternal. They change across time and space. So if we want to understand why statesmen in 1914 behaved in the way that they did, it's useful to think about some of the unspoken assumptions about the world which they may have been carrying around with them in their heads and which may have guided their decisions. The problem with doing this, of course, is that since these assumptions were unspoken, few people ever made any direct reference to them, so they can only be reconstructed indirectly. One important concept that all European statesmen cared about, at least to some degree in 1914, is that of personal and, by extension, national honour. The language of honour and its antonyms, shame and disgrace, were taken much more seriously 100 years ago than they are today. Honour was central to the self-conception of the people who were involved in the July crisis. Honour was also associated with certain assumptions about class and gender. Only the upper class possessed honour. It was a quality monopolised by the aristocracy and the highest tier of society. And male honour was completely different from female honour. For a gentleman to demonstrate honour meant, above all things, showing himself to be physically courageous. Female honour was not about courage at all, but about sexual chastity. The people of 1914 were extremely sensitive to any allegation that they may have behaved dishonourably or shamefully. That is, for a man, that he had demonstrated physical cowardice, or for a woman that her sexual purity was in doubt. Insults were a serious business. Honour had to be defended, if necessarily, violently. Indeed, for men, the use of violence was really the only way to satisfy an insult to one's honour. For their part, women who had been disgraced by an allegation of dishonourable behaviour were expected to call upon a man to defend their honour. The central mechanism for settling disputes about honour was the duel. Duelling, by sword or pistol, had become illegal in some parts of Europe by 1914, but was still openly practised elsewhere. And even in those countries in which the duel was forbidden by law, it still went on covertly. In 1908, 2 Russian generals fought a pistol duel after one of them publicly accused the other of incompetence during his command in the Russo-Japanese War a few years earlier. Duels did not necessarily involve the death of one of the participants, but they did require the shedding of blood before honour could be said to be satisfied. The idea of personal honour could easily translate into national honour, and this is where it may have played a part in the events of 1914. Just as statesmen were highly sensitive to accusations about their own personal honour, they also saw the honour of their nation as a precious and fragile thing that had to be defended. There was a great fear of appearing timid or passive in the face of a provocation, of stepping back from offence which would necessarily involve a loss of face. Emperor Franz Joseph had no personal love for his nephew Archduke Franz Ferdinand, but in the old emperor's mind, the assassination of his heir was an intolerable challenge to the honour of the Habsburg dynasty and had to be avenged. The gendering of nations played a part in this too. Great powers naturally saw themselves as masculine. Hence, they had to demonstrate courage in the great game of international affairs. Theobald Bateman Hollweg suggested in his post-war memoirs that Germany would have suffered what he called self-emasculation if it had acceded to Russian pressure in 1914. On the other hand, smaller nations were often viewed as essentially female because of their modest size and relative weakness. This made them both contemptible as enemies, but also appropriate subjects of aid and assistance. The Austrians and Germans talked about the need to humble and chastise Serbia for its provocation. But conversely, the Russians personified Serbia as a Slavic maiden in danger of being ravished, and justified their intervention on her side as an act of chivalry. The British made much the same argument about Little Belgium after Germany invaded on August 4, 1914. Belgian neutrality was framed in terms of the language of sexual chastity. Britain's intervention to free Belgium from German occupation invoked images, at least implicitly, of rape and revenge. The thing about honour was that it was an all-or-nothing affair. One could not agree to disagree about it. Either you acted to defend your own or someone else's honour, or else your disgrace was complete. So thinking about international relations in those terms discouraged moderation or compromise. It's not that most statesmen in 1914 wanted war exactly, but they viewed war as far less terrible an outcome to a crisis than humiliating capitulation. This acceptance of war as something justifiable, perhaps even rational and necessary, had been encouraged by the metaphor of social Darwinism, which had increasingly come to dominate Western thinking by the end of the 19th century. The publication of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859 had added a new biological dimension to the discussion of war. Darwin had been concerned with the evolution by natural selection of biological species, but his model was soon applied as a metaphor for the evolutions of human races or societies. Darwin had described a world of unceasing change and turmoil, in which species expanded or contracted according to their ability to compete for resources with their neighbours. In the same way, social Darwinists argued that human societies were also engaged in perpetual competition with one another. Just as individual species thrived or dwindled according to the survival of the fittest, so national peoples would rise or fall in the same way. War, in this view, was a necessary and natural process that eliminated the weak and bolstered the strong. This is not to say that everyone craved war in 1914, but there was a curiosity about it, a sense that it was a natural part of life that had been strangely absent from European civilization for some time. There had been, after all, no major war in Europe for over 40 years. Plus, life for the vast majority of ordinary Europeans had never been so safe as at the beginning of the 20th century. The state monopolization of violence through efficient police forces meant that for most citizens, they were less exposed to physical danger than they had ever been before. Public violence had become less obvious and less palatable. Executions continued, but they were no longer held publicly as they once had been. Violent pastimes such as cockfighting and bear baiting were now suppressed. Many people applauded this, but some also wondered if there was something unhealthy about this long reign of peace. They worried that Europeans were getting soft, that in the long run too much security and comfort would undermine Europe's predominance in the world. After all, if the social Darwinists were right, then a lack of willingness to fight might indicate an inability to compete in the struggle for survival. As Friedrich von Bernhardi, a Prussian general and military historian, put it, "War," he said, "is a biological necessity of the first importance, a regulative element in the life of mankind which cannot be dispensed with, since without it an unhealthy development will follow, which excludes every advancement of the race and therefore all real civilization. War furnishes nations with favourable vital conditions, enlarged possibilities of expansion and widened influence, and thus promotes the progress of mankind." Again, this is not to say that everyone in 1914 was determined to go to war. As we saw in the lecture about public opinion, the events of the July crisis were met by many ordinary Europeans with confusion and distress. But there was nonetheless a sense, especially perhaps amongst statesmen, that war wouldn't necessarily be the worst thing that could happen, and might even have some positive side effects. An assumption that we might find complacent or even immoral today, but which to them seemed perfectly reasonable. Okay, in the next lecture we'll begin the countdown to Sarajevo by by looking at 3 of the international crises that preceded July 1914 and helped to establish its stakes. See you then.